Tong, Professor of International Business and Associate Director of the David Lamb Center for International Communication. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Chris Baumann. Chris is a native of Switzerland, where he obtained his bachelor's degree. He also worked in the banking industry in Switzerland before coming to SFU, where he obtained his MBA, and then relocated to Sydney, Australia, where he completed his PhD from Macquarie University. Dr. Bauman is a senior lecturer in business and the assistant director of GACC at Macquarie University. He's currently on sabbatical at SFU, where we're working together on a joint project. Dr. Bauman has received many awards for his teaching and research. Dr. Bauman's presentation today is on customer loyalty and its prediction, a study of Australian retail banking, customers' attitudes and behavior with implications for bankers in the Asia-Pacific region. This presentation will be followed by a Q&A period. Without further ado, I'll turn the podium to Chris.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for being here, and thanks very much for inviting me to give a presentation today. I'm very fortunate to have some of my very old mates here. Of course, Professor Rosalie Tong, who was my supervisor at Simon Fraser University when I did my MBA. Professor Colleen Collins, who was my professor in statistics at SFU. Of course, we've got Catherine Price, who works for SFU Alumni Relations. And we've got Charlotte, who is a good old study mate of mine, and a few more distinguished guests that I will say hello after the presentation. So thanks very much for having me here today. Before I'm going to talk about customer loyalty and banking, I thought banking to some may appear as a bit of a dry topic. So I'm going to start off with an even drier one, which is talking about my journey in life so far, but I'll of course keep it very, very brief. So give me a sign, please, if you feel it's getting a bit boring, just, So as Rosalie Tong has mentioned, I'm originally from Switzerland, from Europe, and I'm going to show you a few slides for each of those locations. But I thought I'll show you the map showing the locations that I've spent most time in my life so far, which would be Switzerland, thankfully Vancouver, Canada, and also Sydney, Australia, where I'm currently based and work for Macquarie University. So if you allow me a few minutes, I'm going to very briefly comment on these countries or markets. So Switzerland, has anybody ever been to Switzerland? Charlotte, you've been there? Okay. So I'm not too sure whether your perception would match mine, but I was born in Switzerland, and that's where I went to school and where I was raised, and where I did my undergraduate degree, focusing on specializing in marketing. And I put a picture here of the city of Zurich, which is, of course, one of the banking capitals of the world. Very close by here, you've got the famous Bahnhofstrasse, where Credit Suisse and Union Bank of Switzerland, the two biggest Swiss banks, have, in fact, their head offices. And I used to work for not one of those two banks, but one of the bigger Swiss banks for 7 years in various functions. Now, if I think back to Switzerland, and this is, of course, not judging at all, but I think given neither positive nor negative, but I think given the industries that are located in the country, like banking, insurance, pharmaceutical, watches, it is probably a country or a society where punctuality is a big deal, and accuracy. By and large, it's probably a fairly performance-driven society, and that is also reflected in the school system. It's got a long history. The country was founded in 1291, so that's a long time ago. And I like the long-standing, culture and history of the country. Having said all of that, my second post, if you will, where I went after Switzerland, after working in the banking industry, was, of course, I came here to beautiful Vancouver to do my MBA at Simon Fraser University, which was a fabulous time. I had a great time. It's a top school and it's a top degree, and I was privileged to collaborate with Professor Tong here, working on my MBA thesis, which at the time was on private banking, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And in actual fact, I had been here before. When I was a schoolboy, I went to school just across the water in North Vancouver. Was a student at the Waldorf School on St. Christopher's Road. It's still there for 1 year. And when I came to SFU, I really, not too sure whether I've learned a lot, you're the best judge of that, but I really was impressed by the professional style of giving presentations, because probably at Swiss universities, it's a bit of a dry style. When I came to SFU, I could see people are really very professional in their way of giving presentations, probably being influenced by David Letterman and the like. And of course I got really interested in conducting research when I started working. I had the privilege to work with Rosalie Tang, and I liked teaching because for the first time in my life I was working as a teaching assistant. So I started to like teaching and research, and if that's the case, that pretty much lines you up as an academic. And consequently I decided to move on and do a doctorate in Australia, in Sydney. So I ended up here in Sydney. If I can briefly comment, I started my doctorate in 2001 really, and completed last year. Australia is obviously a younger country in comparison to maybe Switzerland. But one of the key features in society would be what they call mateship. Mateship is probably hard to define, but it's really about people helping one another and standing in for one another and collaborate. And of course there may be new trends now, but by and large I think it's still noticeable, and it's a fact that I enjoy myself, this, if you will, Australian mateship. The Australians are also famous for having a no worries attitude. I'm not too sure, I don't think I've succeeded in adapting to that no worries attitude just as of yet. I've been there for 7 years, but I think I really admire the Australians for, if you want to generalize, having an approach to life, not taking themselves too seriously, maybe not taking life too seriously, and have a really good lifestyle. Australia would also be very famous, I believe, for a society where everybody is equal. And that's reflected in politics, in the work environment, probably at school. It's very important to the Australian that, at least from the outside, we all appear to have equal chances in life and the like. And of course, a big part of my time in Sydney was then working and being a student at Macquarie University. So that's pretty much where I ended up. Which was, I mean, I love Vancouver, but that was my view from my previous studio that I had in Sydney. So that was also not terribly bad. But let's move on. I think enough about my journey, unless anybody has a question, which would surprise me because you're mostly, all of you are my friends, which is great. So let's now move on and talk about money and banking. So I have already mentioned the term private banking, which I would like to very briefly define, and that's precisely what Rosalie Tang and I were doing when I was still in Vancouver 10 years ago. We were looking at how people choose their private bank, and private banking really would be the high-end version of banking. Private banking is defined as in people who invest at least $1 million US, and that would be investable assets. So it's not your house, it's not your car, it's not your boat, it's really just, it's a nice situation to be in, I suppose. It's really just the cash you've got to invest. That's where it starts. A lot of people, of course, have much, much more money. And consequently, private banking is also very, very international. And I'm not too sure whether you, by coincidence, saw that article in the Time magazine just in February, where they had a bit of an article on private banking. And they had a chart, which I have replicated here, about where people invest their money on a global basis. So there's an estimate of about $7 trillion of invested assets, where people invest not in their home country, but overseas. It could be for many reasons: better financial performance opportunities, arguably better service, and of course, taxation and tax law would be a very big factor as well. Now, I find it interesting to know, given my background, that 27%, which is the majority, if you will, the largest proportion of all the offshore investments, go to my home country, which would be Switzerland. You've got Channel Islands and Isle of Man and Dublin, like British, Irish area, 14%, Luxembourg, 13%, Hong Kong and Singapore, Asian areas would be in total 9%, and you've got others, which is now Dubai. The Middle East is trying to position itself as the new hub for private banking as well. But my study that I did for my doctorate was not on private banking, and that's my chance to make a distinction between the two. What probably the majority of people are doing is really retail banking, so your everyday savings account, maybe some smaller portfolios. So we moved away from doing research in the field of private banking, which is an interesting industry on its own right. But for my doctorate, I did a study on retail banking. Now, of course, I started off with a literature review. This doesn't really do it justice, but I don't want to bore you, which I'm probably already doing. But I just want to provide a very brief overview of what the literature has, found out so far, what researchers have found out so far. If you look at the marketing literature, a very big chunk of the marketing literature would be concerned with customer satisfaction. And customer satisfaction has probably been researched to death. Colleen is laughing. I'm not sure. Have you done research in satisfaction? Yeah. Obviously, it's an important field, and it's probably nearly common sense that if you've got satisfied customers, it will have some positive outcome. And so a lot of work has been done on how customer satisfaction can be measured, how it could be defined, what it is all about. But it was Oliver himself who has actually done quite a lot of work in customer satisfaction who argued it's time to move on from the customer satisfaction stream and start to investigate more the second bullet point here, which is customer loyalty. So Day in 1969 has written a masterpiece on customer loyalty that I'm about to explain in more detail using the blackboard. But one of the big questions in the discussion of customer loyalty and customer satisfaction would really be the association between the two concepts. So do satisfied customers necessarily behave in a more loyal way? Now, there is a controversy over that issue. Jones and Sasser, I put them under customer loyalty. I might as well have put them under association between the two constructs, have written a landmark study labeled Why Satisfied Customers Defect, suggesting that not everybody who's satisfied is necessarily loyal. There could be many reasons why that is the case. I'm just going to talk about it in a moment. So probably to sum up, customer satisfaction is an important field. That's not at all what I'm saying that we're not to be. But probably the new focus now in the marketing research focuses on customer loyalty and on the association between customer satisfaction and loyalty. Now maybe we can have a quick brainstorming here. I'm going to turn off the computer and we can have a bit of a discussion about what customer loyalty really would be all about. Maybe we can get your understanding first before I talk more about how we have defined loyalty. So let's see how technology works. We've practiced this before, so during the rehearsal session. So this is kind of old school. Haven't used one of those for a long time. So maybe I could just get your view on, if you think of customer loyalty, what comes to mind? How do you think could loyalty be measured? Or what really is loyalty? Yeah, please.
Loyalty is more about emotion.
Emotions? Okay. Absolutely. In what way? Right.
Feel satisfied, that's really about it. But there's really no emotional connection to the different transaction. The only thing you're thinking is, okay, it's done, they didn't screw up.
Right.
And I'll do that again as my routine.
Yeah.
But if asked that question and said, would you go back to this place and would you actually refer someone back to this place? Would you do that? And I think that's another level of question that's a little harder than just being satisfied.
Okay, very good. And you mentioned the second term that I'm going to put down, which is referral, or what we call word of mouth. So word of mouth, that's a very good term. Could go both ways, right? In your situation, let's say if you were reasonably satisfied, you may recommend the bank and say, well, they're at least able to do a deposit without, which is a good start. They can at least do a transaction, a simple transaction without a fault. Consequently, you would recommend the bank. But word of mouth can also be defined as a negative, well, if you will, recommendation or bad mouthing when you were dissatisfied and you would actually recommend not to go there. Yeah. What else would you reckon could be loyalty, or how could loyalty be measured in any discipline or any industry? Repeat purchasing? Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So what would that be all about? Repeat purchasing.
You use a product, you get comfortable with it, go next time, that's what you look for.
Yes.
I think that's important. I mean, if you actually go and look for that,
Yes.
rather than simply on the basis of
Yes. Yes. That's very true, and that's been done quite often, especially for products, not so much for services. Because in banking, the question arises, well, what is repeat purchasing? But for products, let's say if you buy Coca-Cola, and then Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, then you could assume, well, there seems to be a pattern. This person obviously purchases both, but has a preference for Coke. So for physical products, repeat purchasing would be a very good measure, and it's often used for loyalty. Yeah, absolutely. In banking, however, fantastic. I'm going to abbreviate share of wallet. So what's share of wallet?
What proportion of all my banking services are with one institution?
That's exactly right. So share of wallet would be...
You didn't have to say it right.
Well, don't want to correct one of my former professors, right? But it is right. So it's essentially the percentage of your business you assign to one provider. That's exactly what it's all about. What else could be measured for loyalty? What else is loyalty? Charlotte, what do you reckon?
That's because I children that are getting older. Instead of repeat purchasing, as a measure of repeat purchasing, I'm thinking, okay, so I can always bank at this institute, therefore my children end up banking at that institute.
Yes.
And again, it's a bit of a pattern, it's a repeat, but it's between people, and in this case,
Yes. Yes. So
it's really, it's almost a combination of repeat and word of mouth, but certainly is more applicable maybe banking than
that's very true. That's a very good point. In actual fact, in my previous study that I'm about to, present to you, we did control for whether a person is using the same bank as their parents, which is very, very true. The only problem is for a lot of people, especially if you sample people in their 20s, yes, they would know, yes, it's exactly the same bank my dad was using. But for a more mature person, it's hard to measure. But it's true, yes. So family, social norm, all your friends bank with whatever. So that's very true. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mentioned Day 1969. He has written a masterpiece coming up with the idea that there is in fact two components to loyalty. So Colleen is nodding, so I'm probably somewhat on track, I hope. So he argued, well, if we have loyalty, there would be two components. The first one, that's back to your point, an emotion. That would be attitude. Well, we could label it emotion, but let's label it attitude. And the second component would be behavior. And these two are, or could be distinctively different from one another. And I give you an example. In an ideal world, and if consumers were rational, you would, which they may or may not be, you would like a provider and then use a provider, right? So you would, for example, like the product and then you purchase. So behavior could be, say, purchase. That would be the logical flow. But there are exceptions to the rule. Let's briefly cover them. Let's say if somebody has a very positive attitude but never purchases, what could that be? That's exactly right. My most preferred example would be the brand Ferrari. Italian sports car. So coincidentally, you mentioned poor. So I would love such a car. I think it's extremely cool and obviously very fast and good looking. But so I have a very positive attitude, but I haven't bought one yet. Let's leave it open there. So that would mean, well, my attitude was very positive, but I'm obviously not able to afford one at this stage of my life, so I'm not going to buy. The opposite would also be possible. Or let's talk about the extreme case first. Or, yeah, the opposite first. Okay, so let's say you dislike the service provider, but you still use them. What would be an example for such a situation?
There's very limited choice, such as the case of Canadian banks.
Yes, absolutely. If there's a limited choice, you're kind of forced to buy, although you don't really like the provider. Classic example, besides banking, could be public transport. A lot of people hate, I shouldn't say this on camera really, but a lot of people, I suppose, hate public transport, but they use it every day, right? So they don't have an affection for the provider, but they're actually customers on a daily basis. That leaves one more scenario, which is also a logical one, I suppose. You don't like a product or a service, and consequently you don't buy. And there would be probably thousands of examples. So that was Day 1969 who came up with that notion. Now what we did in banking, maybe I can go back to the computer now. We came up with a bank loyalty model. And that's, if you will, to a certain extent based on day. So on the left-hand side, we've got the determinants or potential determinants of customer loyalty. And we've categorized them into customer perceptions. That would include satisfaction that we've already covered, so whether or not you're actually satisfied with a product or a service. Affective attitude, so that would be your affection, your emotion, if you will. Service quality. The second box we've labeled market conditions. Of course, you don't make your decisions in isolation. So you're always influenced by the market situation. I'll talk about those in a moment, but typically we broke it up into switching costs, switching benefits, product perception, and customer confidence. We'll talk about them once we discuss the models. And lastly, the customer's characteristics. So the demographic, age, gender, income, length of relationship, how long they've been with the bank, and their recent consumer behavior. And these determinants or potential determinants we used and tested for their association with loyalty. And loyalty we define as current behavior, so how do you behave at this stage, and secondly, your intentions. So if you will, there's a time dimension here. We all have, our business with the bank right now, and we all have intentions whether or not we're actually going to switch or whether we're going to stay. So essentially that would be our model. So unless there's any questions on that model, I'm going to proceed now and show what we actually did find. In order to find out whether these predictors are actually associated with loyalty, we did a survey study. We sent out 5,000 questionnaires, and we got 2,000, which should show you those photos, 3 o'clock a.m. still folding questionnaires. But it somehow paid off because we got nearly 2,000 back, which exceeded our expectations. That's probably a fairly good response rate. And it was interesting to see because when you enter all the data, that's not necessarily the most exciting part of your research, really. But yes. Yeah. Hopefully that was a once in a lifetime. But it was interesting because a lot of people, or quite a substantial amount of people, actually made additional comments, misunderstanding that, thinking that I'm a bank, saying, thank you so very much for this study. Please improve banking services. I'm going, well, I'm with you on that one. I wish I could. But I don't work for a bank. It was quite interesting. So one of the key measures for current behavior, or the only measure for current behavior, really was share of wallet that Colleen has kindly defined for us. In order to make it simple for respondents, we didn't ask for the actual percentage, which would have been more accurate. If I had to do the study again, I would probably even ask for the actual percentage this time around. But for this purpose, we offered quartiles to respondents, thinking based on the assumption well, it would be much easier for a respondent to think, well, probably I've got 75 to 100% of my banking with my main bank, or I've got 0 to 25%, but to actually pinpoint, okay, it's 55.45 would be a big ask. But anyways, that's already done. And then we did quite a few statistical tests, but I'm not going to bore you. We did principal component analysis to reduce the data. We did, which is very classic t-tests, ANOVAs and chi-square tests. And the master, or the key test was really doing regressions. For the current behavior models, we used ordinal logistic regressions based on the nature of the dependent variable being measured in quartiles. But that's only a side remark, really. Now, maybe I can briefly talk you through a few, not really models as of yet, but just frequencies, if you will. The first one would be the number of current bank suppliers that respondents are using. And that was interesting to note because 36%, so I highlighted the column percentage so we always know where to look. The 36% of all respondents were only using one bank. So they are obviously, probably by all definitions, except for attitude, they are loyal in terms of their behavior because they only have one bank, right? But still surprisingly, nearly 45% were using two banks, which kind of supported the need for this study. I mean, if 100% of people were using only one bank, well, there's no need for a loyalty study. You know everybody is loyal, right? At least in terms of their behavior. But this was a clear indication, well, no, people seem to be spreading out their business. We knew this from private banking. The wealthy typically do spread out their investments, probably in order to reduce risk and also in order to compare performance of the banking institutions. But to me, it was a tiny bit of a surprise that even at the retail banking level, so many people, well, 45% having two banks and 14% having three banks, are using a multiple of banks, really. 7 banks seems to be, well, 6 banks seems to be the ceiling. One person is using 7 banks, but I wonder why, really. Probably hard to, just to keep the tax agent busy. And the second frequency overview I would like to present, which is also kind of interesting and surprising, was we looked at people's recent behavior. Now, remember my little Coca-Cola, Pepsi pattern, which is actually the Markov, based on the Markov model, Markov chains, suggests that your recent behavior predicts your future behavior. That may or may not always be true. But what we found here was, well, if we look at people who had recently or have recently closed an account with the bank, that will be 10%. This may not be all that much, but still, if you think about it, in the last few weeks, I suppose, 10% of the sample has actually closed an account with their main bank, which does not necessarily suggest loyal behavior, unless people have moved or whatever. And at the same time, nearly 20% have recently opened an account with a competitor. And that clearly suggests that people may not necessarily be loyal, because if I already have a bank account but I'm opening a new one, I may not be fully satisfied, and I may be on the verge of switching. Waiting for time. Okay. Also an indication of loyalty that we have not yet discussed would be tenure or length of relationship. So, of course, there would be a correlation between age and, yeah, please. The data was collected in 2002, sorry. Oh, where? In Australia.
I'm not really very familiar with the banking system.
Yes.
More like the Canadian, which has 6 big banks.
Yes.
More like
More like
the US.
the Canadian. There are 4 or 5 big banks, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, ANZ, Westpac, St. George. These would be the big major brands that you would find throughout the country. There are a few credit unions, but it's not as common as in Canada. most of the successful credit unions, actually St. George is a former credit union. It was a successful credit union that about 10 or 15 years ago transformed itself into, if you will, a real bank. So if that's your point, which is a good one, it's probably fairly similar to Canada, and there would be limited choice to a certain extent. And there are very few foreign banks. Well, there's HSBC now, there's ING, but they only offer online accounts. So, and then high-end banking, you would have a few international banks such as Swiss banks. But in that respect, there is probably a limited choice. Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a good one. Okay, so length of relationship would also be a measure of loyalty, arguably. Of course, it would be correlated, and it was to a certain extent, with age. I mean, in order to have been with the bank for 15 years, you would have to be at least, I suppose, in your late 30s, if not 40s. But it was interesting to note that nearly 50%, or 40%, really, 41%, have been a customer of their main bank for 15 years plus. That's quite a long time, really. That's quite a long time. So there seems to be some switching, as we saw before, or some people that may be sitting on the fence. But by and large, people seem to be nonetheless fairly loyal in terms of, if we look at length of relationship. But we could conclude that it's not an easy discussion. This loyalty discussion is not trivial by no means. So we already mentioned customer satisfaction. And in this study, satisfaction was simply measured based on one question. Some people argue it's a multi-dimensional construct. Some people argue it's really only a one-dimensional construct. We used it as a one-dimensional construct, meaning there was one question. Overall, I am satisfied with my main bank. Now, contrary to what people probably would tell you at the pub over a nice Australian beer, Sydney Harbour, everybody tells you, well, we kind of dislike banks and the services are not up to speed and the fees are very high. But when we look at the actual data, interestingly enough, out of the 2,000, we could see that the majority of people, nearly 700, actually ticked, well, I agree with the statement. I believe that I am very satisfied with my bank. And another, the second biggest group, would be strongly agree. They love their bank. They seem to be at least very happy with their service. And then it drops to somewhat degree, which would still be around 320 or so. Neutral, so these people here, 220 or so, are not quite sure. Well, they don't really think it's terribly bad, but it's also not very exciting. And then these people here, but that would be in the hundreds per category, are clearly not satisfied. They believe that the bank is really not up to speed. But this again showed that, not only the loyalty discussion is a complex one, but also the satisfaction discussion is a complex one. Now let's jump to the models, unless somebody has a question or a comment. So I'm going to show you the model one more time, because the next model that I'm about to discuss, I can't really pinpoint here all that much, would be current behavior. I'm not going to discuss all 6 models, otherwise I think we all need a very strong coffee in between. So I've reduced my discussion for today to 3 models, and if you get bored, let me know, I'll speed up. So I'm going to talk about share of wallet deposits, and then I'm going to talk about share of wallet debts and loans, and I've only picked one of the behavioral intention models, which would be willingness to recommend, or word of mouth, really. So let's jump into it, and let's talk about share of wallet deposits. So first I'm going to show you the nature of the actual variable, the dependent variable, if you will, which is share of wallet deposits. Essentially, we measured share of wallet deposits, asking people what percentage of their everyday banking, if you will, checking account, savings account, small investments and the like on the depositing side, so excluding borrowings, what percentage of their overall business has been assigned to their main bank. And again, that was measured in quartiles, so 0 to 25%, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, 75 to 100. And what we could see here was that the majority of people, surprisingly, stated that only, so 40%, stated that they only assign 0 to 25% of their overall business to their main bank. And we left it open how to define main bank. We thought about defining main bank, but I think everybody knows themselves what they perceive to be their main bank. Now, typically, I would have assumed that the main bank could be the one where you really have your deposits, but for some people, it may also be where they actually have their home loan. So, I don't know, their mortgage. But in any case, this clearly shows, again, that loyalty is not a given. So a lot of people don't seem to be tremendously loyal just towards one bank, based on what we see here. On the other end of the spectrum, we can see that about 34% are probably loyal in a behavioral sense because they have assigned 76 to 100%, probably some of them really 100% to their main bank. While we still have like 12 and 14% that are somewhat sitting on the fence and seem to have spread out their business nonetheless. So again, it's quite a complex discussion. But to a banker and also to an academic, the question would be, well, how can we predict loyalty or share of wallet specifically here? Now, the first table I'm going to show you here is a chi-square test. What we really only have to focus on, if you will, would be the P column, which is significance level. What this shows, and I've highlighted them in yellow, the 3 ones that are significant, meaning there's a significant difference between gender in terms of share of wallet. It was higher for females and lower for males, suggesting so females typically have a higher share of wallet when it comes to deposits, and males have a lower share of wallet when it comes to deposits. Customers who have recently opened an account with a competitor had a significantly lower share of wallet, suggesting that previous behavior in actual fact really does explain current behavior and arguably even future behavior. Education, people or respondents without a university degree were found to have a lower share of wallet in comparison to the people or respondents that had no university degree. So, if you will, the more education, the lower your share of wallet. And the other 3 were not significant. I'm going to talk about them nonetheless at a later stage. So the first model was, and I put it in italics, where we factored in all the potential predictors. Remember the model I had shown you, or I showed you where you saw like, the potential predictors. So the first model was run using all those variables available. That's an important distinction because later on I'm going to show you a model where we actually have reduced the number of variables that potentially could predict loyalty. And what we found here, I'm going to briefly talk you through. An important figure would be this 0.24, which indicates the model explains 24% of the variation in share of wallet. It may appear low, but in actual fact, in comparison to previous research, it's quite substantial. If you can explain 24% of actual behavior, like people how really behave, it's quite substantial. So we can explain about a quarter of how people behave. And again, the model shows affective attitude. Now the coefficient, because it's an ordinal logistic regression, interestingly enough, is kind of nearly the opposite way. So if you see negative, it's actually positive. Don't worry about it, that's a statistical thing. It will be different for the, if you will, normal regressions. But for ordinal logistic regressions, the way it was done here, it's kind of negative. Meaning, for a negative, so affective attitude, a negative association actually implies that it is a positive association. Simply put, really, simply put, it really means the more you like your bank, the more you feel for your bank, if you will, the more share of wallet you assign, the higher the percentage you assign to that bank. And that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, if you like them, then you give them more money. In H, for H, it's a negative association, if you will, meaning the older a respondent, the lower their share of wallet. And I'm going to show you a chart later on income and age. So we don't have to discuss it at this stage in detail. And for income, it's exactly the same. So the higher a person's income, the lower their share of wallet. And that could be, and I'm going to show you again, I'm going to show you a chart in a moment, so let's discuss it when we reach that bridge. Confidence in judgment. The higher a person's confidence in judging the banking market, so the questions were around, do you feel confident in judging the banking industry in Australia, if you will? So people who are, well, that's of course self-reported. People who argue or find that they are confident in judging the banks, they assign more money. Probably they feel confident, they know, okay, I've chosen this bank, it is clearly the best one, so here's my cash, right? And people who were not so confident then spread out and are not really sure what they're doing. And gender, I've already discussed, so there was a higher share of wallet for females as opposed to for males. So that would be one model explaining loyalty. Now, as promised, we also run the model again based on that's the result here. We tested for the association based on predictors that should be known to the bank, or where the bank really has a good idea of what they're all about. So, for example, affective attitude and satisfaction, a bank really doesn't know unless you conduct a survey study or you ask people at the bank branch. But I'm not too sure whether you bank with Royal Bank or CIBC or whatever, they don't know your level of satisfaction today, right? They don't know whether you've just been to a bank branch and you were dissatisfied. It's no way they would know. But they know a few things. They know, of course, your age. They know your gender. They know your location. They know your address. They know your income, more or less. So they know quite a few things about you. And these things can be and are also used, of course, to profile customers. So we rerun the models only using potential predictors that should be known to the bank. And what we found was the following. Well, remember the Goodman-Kruskal gamma here? Before it was 24% or 0.24. Now it's 0.17. So it's dropped. But in all fairness, we also used a much, much smaller number of potential predictors. And we can still explain 17%. I mean, it's still kind of substantial if you consider that it's really only based on the variables a bank should know. Now, what are these variables? The first one would be age. Yes, the bank knows your age. The bank knows your income. A bank may or may not also know whether you have actually opened an account with a competitor. How so? Well, banks actually do these analyses, of course. And they check. No, that's okay. I know it's getting really important. Well, thanks very much for being here in the first place. So banks do analyze the stream of, or the flow of money. And when there is a transaction from your bank account to a competitor's bank account in the same name, there's a fair chance you actually do have an account with a competitor. And if that's a recent occurrence, they would know, well, you may have opened a bank just in the recent past. And that seems to be a very good predictor of your share of wallet as well. And gender, again, higher for females than for males. So based on these characteristics that are more or less known to the bank, customers can be profiled that may, and that's what it's all about, some customers may have potential for more business. Because that's one of the big arguments why share of wallet would be, in my view, an ideal measure of loyalty. Let's say if you're in charge of bank marketing and you want to target people to assign more business. Let's say if somebody has got $50,000 with you and you know, well, $50,000 is all they've got. Well, now if you wine and dine them, how could they possibly assign more? I mean, of course, I'm not arguing that you should lower the standard. But, I mean, if you wine and dine them, there's no potential for growth unless they win the lottery. But if somebody's got $50,000 sitting at my bank and I know, well, overall they've got $1 million, well, there's a huge potential. And they could switch a lot of funds to my bank if I did some marketing, if I implemented marketing action. And that's why share of wallet really is probably one of the key measures for a bank to see whether or not marketing action would be potentially beneficial, yes or no. So when we take a detailed look at the association between share of wallet deposits and age, what we can find here, remember the overall association was negative. So the older a respondent, the lower their share of wallet. And I think you can see this very nicely here. There were only very few people in the below 18 category, so it really starts 18 to 24, nearly in a linear fashion goes down to the people in their mid-60s. And when you look at the last category, people 75 plus, then it goes up dramatically. Why so? We haven't really asked people, but we can only speculate. Well, probably towards when you've reached a more mature age and you're retired, you probably want to somehow consolidate your business. You want to maybe slow down a bit, maybe pass on some of your assets to your children and grandchildren. So you want to simplify things. I don't think unless you really do it as a hobby, when you're, let's say, 75 or 80, you still want to actively manage different portfolios with different banks, which people typically do in their mid stage of their life. I mean, very young people typically probably would not necessarily have the funds to justify too many bank transactions with multiple of banks. But people in their mid-30s and 40s and then up to the 50s, when the income really goes up, may have much, much more reason to spread their business and become a bit more proactive. So the next model I would like to show would be share of wallet debts and loans, so on the borrowing side. Again, why don't you take a quick look at the distribution of the dependent variable. So it's a similar pattern to the previous one, meaning at the extremes, if you will, low and high share of wallet, you would find the majority of respondents, and in the middle you have smaller percentages. Again, suggesting, well, there seems to be some spreading of business also on the borrowing side. 42% of people have the majority of their borrowings with the main bank, but 41% seem to have spread it out quite a bit, 0 to 25% share of wallet. Now it's the same pattern for the tables and charts. So first you would see a chi-square of the categorical data. And here culture comes into play. So that's interesting. Keep in mind, before, culture was not significant, meaning when it comes to share of wallet deposits, there were no significant difference between the cultural groups in that study. The cultural groups in that study were the Australian and New Zealanders in one category, so the Aussies and the New Zealanders, because of course there's quite a bit, it's only 3 hours by plane, so that would be the biggest group. Secondly, the Europeans, people that was self-declared, of course, as everything in this study, people who argue, well, I've got a European heritage and therefore, that's my background. And the third group would be other, which would be predominantly immigrants from Asia, China and Thailand and Vietnam. So in terms of share of wallet debts and loans, borrowings, there were significant differences between these cultural groups. And I'm going to talk about it in a moment. And people who had recently opened an account with a competitor, again, recent behavior, was also significant. Meaning people who had actually recently opened an account with a competitor had lower share of wallet. Again, suggesting, well, they may really be switching sooner or later. And the other 3 or 4 variables were not significant, or there were no significant differences in terms of share of wallet borrowings. Let's take a look at the model. Yeah.
Under culture, when we look at others, let's say if there was a Chinese that was born and raised in New Zealand, does it fall to category 1 or does the person fall to the 3rd category?
Very good question. It would be depending on how the person categorized themselves. So if self-declaration. And the question in the questionnaire was, it was not based on your legal status. It was based on how do you perceive yourself? Do you perceive yourself to be, if you will, Chinese or New Zealander or Australian? We have not made that distinction, which in retrospective probably would have been a very good idea. Yeah.
Chris, I also wanted
Yeah.
how broadly the survey was sent throughout Australia?
Yes.
Or was it in and out of Sydney?
Oh, very good question. Throughout Australia.
So you would get rural and urban?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It was spread pretty much, not entirely, but pretty much in line with the ABS data, Australian Bureau of Statistics. So the majority was sent out in New South Wales and Victoria. But proportionally based on the population number, we also had people in Perth, Western Australia, Tasmania, Northern Territory, ACT, Australian Capital Territory. So it was really, more or less, really representative of the country. It was very interesting when we sent out the questionnaires because I got all the labels and I've learned a lot about Australia. And I mean, in a lot of cases, the cities where people live were not Sydney, Melbourne or Perth, but, Wagga Wagga and smaller towns that most of us would not have ever have heard of, or probably are not going to visit in the near future. So if we take a look at the model, that's again based on all the potential predictors. We could see this model again explained 24%, which is nearly a bit of a miracle, but we double checked the figure and it was 24%. This time around, because it's a different nature, and that probably really is a justification why we have modeled loyalty based on share of wallet deposits and also borrowings. It seems the predictors are definitely different. That seems to suggest that, well, loyalty is very multidimensional in well, probably per se, but especially in banking. So you could not just have one loyalty model. It really has to be separated for depositing money and borrowing money. Because what came into play here, and we haven't touched upon that variable as of yet, would be switching costs. Switching costs were, as all variables and questions in this survey, of course, a matter of perception. But switching costs were defined as how difficult is it for you to switch banks. And that could be in monetary terms, and also in terms of hassle, time, filling in forms. And the variable captures both. And interestingly enough, for borrowings, it was the strongest predictor, which probably suggests, well, a lot of people feel they're locked in, right? You've got a home loan, you've got a car loan, whatever it may be, and it's much more difficult to switch. It's not very difficult to switch a savings account. You just have to close it. You probably get hassled. Whoa, why are you closing it? But you say, look, I don't want to have it anymore. Close it, right? And you open a new one. But when it comes to borrowings, the amounts are also much larger, typically, right? The home loan could be $500,000, $1 million. And you say, well, if you're lucky, your savings account would be in the same category. But so switching costs was the strongest predictor. So the higher they were perceived, then the higher the share of wallet, right? So if people believe that switching costs are very high, then they assign more money, which kind of makes sense. Age was, again, positive, if you will, or negative, depending on how you view the world. So the older a respondent, the lower their share of wallet, typically. Culture was a significant predictor here as well. It was the highest for the Australians and New Zealanders, and it was followed by the Europeans, and the least loyal, if you will, were the so-called other group. Income, the higher your income, and that's surprising because that's contrary to what we found previously for the share of wallet deposit model. The higher your income, the higher your share of wallet for share of wallet borrowings. And also different to the previous model, for females, the share of wallet was actually lower, while for deposits it was higher. So why would that be? We don't really know. For income, it could be, well, the higher your income, the better your chances of getting all your loans from one provider. As opposed to let's say if you just start off in life and you're not yet sitting on a high income, and you may not be able to get your car loan and your home loan from one provider, so you may have to shop around and spread out your business. While in the field of deposit investments, of course, that wouldn't play. Probably have to speed up a tiny bit, so we don't have to discuss it in detail unless you're terribly interested. But we also rerun this model based on only factors that should be known to the bank. And what we could find here was age was a significant predictor. So the higher your age, again, the lower your share of wallet. The higher your income, the higher your share of wallet. We've discussed this already. State of residence was also significant. The highest being the Australian Capital Territory, so that's where Canberra is the capital of Australia, is located. We're somewhere between, pretty much in the middle between, well, more or less, between Sydney and Melbourne, because the two could not figure out, both wanted to be the capital of Australia. So they ended up, determining that Canberra, which up until that stage was really only a small sheep farm station, really, if I may say so, became the capital of the country. So they seem to have the highest share of wallet. And the lowest would be the people who reside in South Australia. So that would be Adelaide and Barossa Valley and the like. And that probably is somewhat related to the last predictor, which was residential location. So people in rural areas were found to have a higher level of share of wallet, which probably makes sense if you live out in the country, and keep in mind Australia, like Canada, is a very, very big country. And once you really go out of the big metropolitan areas, it really becomes rural in the deepest sense of the word. And there may or may not be all of the major brands available. If it's a bigger town, there would still be all the big 4 or 5 Aussie banks. But if you really go far out, there may only be 1 or 2 banks. So there is a limited choice, and consequently share of wallet would be higher. and logically, therefore, for urban residents like Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, Cairns, Brisbane, and the like, the bigger metropolitan cities, really, share of wallet was much lower, or significantly lower, meaning people really have a chance to spread out their business. Yeah, okay. So now, just a brief look here, or detailed look at the relationship between the income of respondent and their share of wallet in terms of debts and loans. What we can see here, remember I said it was generally positive, meaning the higher your income, the higher your share of wallet. And that's very nicely reflected in that chart here, where you can see let's start at 20,000 to 40,000 here. It goes up, not in a linear fashion by no means, but it goes up to around about 2.7, 2.8 out of 4. That's on a 4-point scale. And it only drops for people who are in a category of 120,000 plus, which would be high for Australian standards. And that's, of course, in Australian dollars per year. So, and that's, again, probably people, again, I've made that point before, people who are sitting on a higher income may have better chances of getting all their borrowings from one provider. In actual fact, they may even get preferential conditions if they do so, right? If you're in the right category, if you're in, let's say, $100,000 in Australia, and you get your home loan, your car loan, all the loans pretty much from one provider, you may be able to do a bit of negotiation and get a better deal. Now, I've got one more model to discuss. Are you still in? Okay. Well, the last one would be, I've chosen one of the behavioral intention ones, which is a willingness to recommend or word of mouth. So to what extent are you planning to, or are you willing to recommend your main bank to a family member or a friend or whatnot? Now, we find slightly different results here in comparison to the current behavior models. A t-test here showed all of these variables here had significant differences between the groups. So, for example, and this time around you can see the means for yourselves. So recently opened an account with a competitor. Respondents who have not recently opened a bank account with a competitor had a mean of 0.08, meaning, well, they're not really keen to recommend, but they seem to be, that was -3 to +3. So that suggests, well, they're neutral, they're not keen, but they're at least on the positive side. While people who have recently opened an account were on the negative side. Their mean was 0.36 minus. So they're actually not willing to recommend at all. If we look at gender, for example, it was higher for females than for males. For females, it was 0.05. For males, it was -0.08. Education, again, a factor here. People who went to university were significantly less likely to recommend their bank as opposed to people who actually have been to university. Residential location, people in rural areas were significantly more likely to recommend their bank as opposed to people in urban areas. And recently closed account with a main bank, again, kind of logical, if you will. People who have not recently closed an account with their main bank seem to be more willing to recommend the bank. But let's move on. That's only descriptives, really. Culture. So that was not significant. There were no significant differences between the cultural group. But nonetheless, if you look at the actual means, you could see that for Australians and New Zealanders, the mean was 0.02. For the Europeans, it was -0.02. And for the other group, it was -0.13. Having said all of this, keep in mind, please, it was not a significant difference. Let's take a look at the model. Again, the first model shows the result of the testing of all potential predictors. And we can see here, kind of makes sense, I suppose. First of all, we can explain 72% of the model. That's very substantial. We were actually surprised ourselves. 72%, that's typically you can always explain more for intention as opposed to actual behavior. Remember before actual behavior we could explain about 24%, which is low in comparison to the intentions models. But nearly always in marketing research, I suppose, for intentions, the prediction is much easier than for actual behavior. Actual behavior, the two are not always related. And I think you can tell that very easily when you talk to people who smoke, right? And you have a beer with them and you say, oh, you're still smoking? Yeah. I'm about to give up, right? So the intention is I want to give up smoking. Meet them again in 2 weeks and they're still smoking. And you go, well, were you not about to quit? Yes, I'm about to quit. I will soon, but so there could well be, and that probably applies to many, many areas of life, there could be a distinction between what people intend to do and what they actually do. And as a rule of thumb, predicting or explaining actual behavior is much more challenging than predicting and explaining intentions. So here we're talking about intentions. So we can explain 72%. Non-surprisingly, people who have an affection or feel positive about their bank are much more likely to recommend their bank. That's unstandardized coefficient of 0.487 is very, very high. So it's a very strong predictor, and it's of course significant. These are all significant predictors. At the same time, satisfaction comes into play. So people who are satisfied are more willing to recommend. That makes sense as well. Fees and interest rates. That's the first time that fees and interest rates come into play, which surprises me. Because by the very logic or nature, if you think about banking, to me as a former banker, I mean, banking probably really is about money, right? It's not about entertainment, or it's really, do you get more cash at the end of the day, yes or no? So to me, one of the key variables would have probably been, well, are the fees low and are the interest rates and investment returns high? And then I would assign more. I would have expected fees and interest rates to be one of the key predictors for both share of wallet deposits and share of wallet borrowings, but it was not. But it seems to come into play when people actually recommend the bank. And confidence in judgment, the ones who feel that they're confident in judging the bank or the banking industry are the ones who are also more likely to recommend. Now, to sum this all up, because I know we probably want to have some time for questions and answers, if I'm able to give answers, really. If we look at the model one last time, the next slide I'm going to show you provides a table summarizing all the results. And because it is all the results, it is fairly small, so I do apologize. But let's say it's really more for illustration purposes. Now what we can see here, so remember we've got the 6 models, the 3 current behavior and 3 future intention models. And the next slide provides you with an overview of those 6 models here. They should be all like, the first model would be here, share of wallet deposits, share of wallet borrowings, the one we discussed. There was also model share of wallet credit cards, which I did not discuss. And then over at the intention side, willingness to recommend, which we've just discussed. And short and long-term willingness to stay with the bank. Short-term was defined as up to 1 year, I believe, and long-term was in the next 5 years. Are you still going to be a customer, yes or no? Now, what you can see, and that's probably for academics the most interesting slide. If we look at the factors that predict current behavior, so that would be panel A, we can see that the demographics, such as age, income, gender, and cultural background, are actually the much stronger predictors of a customer's loyalty in terms of actual behavior. Now, if you look at, I wish I had a bit of a stick to show this here, but if you look at panel B, where you've got overall satisfaction, satisfaction was not a significant predictor in the multivariate analysis of any of the 3 current behavior models. That's not to say that, of course, there is a correlation, and I'm not saying that satisfaction is not important, but when you throw all the variables into one pot, it seems that the demographic variables are overruling the affection and satisfaction variables. And therefore, we could conclude that the demographics, customer characteristics may be the stronger predictors of loyalty in terms of actual behavior, which is a bit of a surprising finding because the traditional marketing literature focuses very strongly on satisfaction and very little on demographic factors. Demographic factors, so in conclusion, we could probably argue that where a customer is in life in terms of their age, in terms of how much they earn, where they live, may explain much, much more of their behavior than whether or not they are actually satisfied. In contrast, when looking at behavioral intentions on the right-hand side, we can see that none of the demographic factors were unique, therefore in a multivariate testing situation, predictors of behavioral intentions. However, we say that overall satisfaction was a unique predictors for all of the 3 behavioral intentions models. So when it comes to intentions in the future, what are you going to do in the future? Are you going to recommend? Are you going to stay? Satisfaction seems to play a major role, but not so much your stage in life and who you are. So that's, I mean, we could draw many more conclusions, but that's probably one of the key conclusions I could draw here based on all the 6 models, if that makes sense to you. But let me actually come to the conclusions. So what are some of the implications for academics? Well, I've already mentioned one of them. Well, demographic variables such as age, gender, and income may in actual fact be quite a strong, or may in actual fact maybe quite a strong predictor of strong predictors of loyalty, particularly when it comes to actual behavior, current behavior share of wallet. Although the literature generally focuses very strongly on satisfaction and attitude. We also tested one more concept that I have not yet touched upon, and that would be service quality. If you recall my overview model, the third item under customer perception would actually be service quality. Some people argue that service quality could or should be measured separately from overall satisfaction and affective attitude. Remember my Ferrari example, so we have attitude, behavior, and then satisfaction somehow links to these ones, but your perception of service quality would be separate. Now that's how we actually measured service quality. We measured it separately using a well-known concept called SERVQUAL. SERVQUAL was developed by 3 famous researchers, Parasuraman, Seitamel, and Berry. They came up with a tool to measure SERVQUAL, and they broke it up into tangibles, so a tangible element of a service. So, you know, there's a big debate. The very simple definition of, well, a service or a product, what's the difference, would be, well, a product is tangible and can be touched, and a service cannot be touched. That may or may not be true. I think Christopher Lovelock has written about this. And to make it more complex, the two are not so distinctively different necessarily, because a lot of services contain at least some tangible element. If you think of air travel, yes, it is a service, but it's very tangible because you step on board a plane. That's very tangible. Or medical services. Well, it's a service, but they take your blood. I mean, to me, that's probably one of the, that's very tangible, isn't it? Or education. Well, yes, we are talking and hopefully sharing knowledge, but it's also about the textbooks and the lecture room and the lecturer and professor and the like. So tangibles could be one factor that comes into play for service quality. Reliability, well, is a plane leaving on time, yes or no? Responsiveness, let's say you've got a problem with your bank and you approach them, are they going to look into it and say, well, sure, let's, sit down, we'll help you, or are they just, that happens, look for you. We're not really interested in your problem. So responsiveness, assurance, trust, I suppose. If you think of banking, you invest money, so you invest $100,000, you would hope that in 5 years it's still somewhere around. That would be assurance or trust. And empathy, simply, well, do you or do you not like the provider? So having said all of this, that was, of course, a very, very brief summary of what SERVQUAL deserves a much bigger discussion. But nonetheless, in this study, none of those 5 SERVQUAL elements were significantly associated with any of the loyalty measures, the 6 loyalty measures, in the multivariate analysis. So I'm not talking about bivariate. The difference between bivariate and multivariate, bivariate would be just looking at 2 variables. So for example, what is the association between satisfaction and share of wallet? Multivariate analysis includes all of them in one go, so it's probably a bit more rigorous, if I may say so. And in a multivariate analysis of this study, none of the SERVQUAL factors were significantly associated with any of the loyalty measures. And that for academics probably adds to the discussion whether or not service quality has to be measured separately from overall satisfaction and effective attitude. Based on what we saw here, SERVQUAL in the multivariate analysis was certainly not significant. Now, for practitioners or bankers, what I've just shown you, those models, we discussed 3, but we developed 6. They could be used to profile customers on various dimensions. Well, first of all, we already touched upon share of wallet, so we can see, or we can profile customers based on whether or not there is potential for growth. Or, and that would be in the field of behavioral intentions, we can attempt to profile customers that may, in actual fact, be on the verge of defecting. So if we can see, okay, well, this particular customer segment seems to be intending to leave short or long term. And if they are in a profitable segment, I suppose, action should be taken before they leave, right? Like maybe whatever, depending on the nature of the business, the customer could be contacted, trying to see whether there was a problem, trying to fix the problem, of course. So I suppose all that we've done here for practitioners would be input to profile customers that have potential for growth and profile customers that are on the verge of defecting. Yeah, now this was probably a lot of statistic stuff, so I thought I'd put a picture of the, to relax a bit for, of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And that shall be the background while we have a bit of a discussion, if you have any questions or comments.
Yeah, please. Just had a question in regards to the service quality. You said that was actually a different, probably like, you didn't segment that into the actual analysis, the service quality aspect, right? But I'm looking at, I guess, the study there, the affective attitude towards bank, and that was a pretty high correlation there in terms of willingness to recommend. Yes. Won't that link into the service quality? Like, wouldn't attitude be based on the service quality, the perception of service quality? Yes.
I mean, overall satisfaction, affective attitude, and service quality are certainly related with one another. But you can only make a conclusion to what extent they are related if you've actually statistically tested so, right? So by the very nature, you could say, well, if they have a nice bank building, which would be tangibles, and I trust them, which would be assurance, high level of empathy, which would relate to attitude, well, let's just put it all into one. That would be possible, and that's very often done. A lot of researchers either just measure service quality or satisfaction, let alone attitude. But we felt we wanted to test which of the 3 concepts, if you will, would be the strongest to predict loyalty. Some people have also done research in the field of what you're saying, to what extent would service quality simply be a measure of overall satisfaction. And it depends on the industry. There could be differences between, banking and education, travel and the like, library services. So I wouldn't want to make a final conclusion to what extent, one could include or should exclude SERVQUAL. But I think what we found in our study was, if you look at only the bivariate analysis, meaning you only look at the 2 variables in simple terms, they were not necessarily weak predictors. But when you look at the overall picture in a multivariate testing, where you include all the potential predictors and you exclude them one by one based on their level of significance and explanatory power, we found that service quality was kind of overpowered by overall satisfaction and affective attitude. Having said all of that, if somebody were to replicate the study, you could probably then consequently exclude service quality and have a smaller, shorter questionnaire and only include satisfaction and affective attitude. That's probably a fair conclusion. But how this translates into different studies in related or different industries, I'm not too sure. Yeah?
I assume that you presented these findings to people in the banking sector. What was their response? I mean, in the sense that SERVQUAL did not have any impact at all. Yes. So to a large extent, age, income, gender, those are things which are a little bit beyond control of the banks. Yes. So in a sense, the implication I'm understanding this correctly, is that really if they vary or tinker with their service, it's not going to make that much of a difference.
Yes.
Right? So what are the real implications for the banks? Located in the right location?
Yes. No, very good question. I think for bankers and the ones I've spoken to, what's probably unique about the study, banks of course conduct a lot of market research themselves, but nearly always it's only looking at their own customer database. So it kind of excludes customers of a competitor, while this study looks at the cross-section of all banks. So for example, level of satisfaction would not only be the Commonwealth Bank, for example, or St. George, but it really reflects the overall view. And that's probably what is kind of what they liked in particular about it. Service quality is definitely still important. I'm not arguing that service quality would not be important. But probably when you look at the overall picture, it seems in predicting loyalty, satisfaction itself, overall satisfaction, so not broken up into those little 5 categories, and also affection, the emotion towards the bank that one of you gentlemen actually brought into discussion, seem to be much better predictors in explaining loyalty, and therefore could be used for banks. Probably the ultimate value would be, well, first of all, they could profile customers based on the results. And secondly, in traditional banking research, they would have had to include all SERVQUAL dimensions, like the 5 questions and overall satisfaction and affective question, which of course blows up the questionnaire. So if this were to be true, I suppose they could probably reduce their questionnaires and simply ask, well, are you satisfied overall? And do you like the bank? Affective attitude questions, and exclude the SERVQUAL questions, because it doesn't seem to explain a lot of loyalty. And they would still be able to predict more or less how people will behave. I'm not too sure whether that makes sense. So it's not arguing against SERVQUAL, but probably one could argue that it may be possible to use the variables that were significant here to predict loyalty and exclude those SERVQUAL questions. And that's
I totally agree with you on that. And I can see the value of your study as compared with, let's say, the kinds of banking surveys that each of the individual banks do on their own, because you're really giving the bird's eye view of what the situation is.
Yeah.
But I guess if I were a bank, when I look at these findings, I mean, not to say that SERVQUAL is totally irrelevant, I think I would be a little bit concerned if I were a bank, because I think currently aren't the banks focusing very much on improving, like different aspects of service quality or like whatever they can provide.
Yeah.
But then, in fact, what you see here is that really it doesn't, it's not as significant as the other variables like age, income, gender, and culture, and those are to a large extent really beyond their control, right? And so therefore, aside from the fact that they should be located in places where it fits those kind of demographic profiles, it's not going to help them considerably.
Well, yes.
For example, if we go back to the overview table, if you look at, for example, overall satisfaction, and assuming that, and they are correlated, so SERVQUAL probably in some way, and I've actually we've investigated this in a separate study, there is an association between some of the SERVQUAL elements and overall satisfaction. Not all of them contribute equally, but probably what you see in panel B, overall satisfaction, would probably, back to your question, be an overall summary variable of, perception of service quality. So I'm not arguing that they should be excluded, by no means. But if space was of the issue and the bank really wanted to examine different aspects of their products, they may or may not want to include all of the SERVQUAL elements and maybe focus on some other elements. But probably the variable overall satisfaction may be able to capture most of what is measured in service quality.
Should it be rather, instead of saying we're a friendly bank or we have fabulous looking physical bank, come to us because we can take care of your investment needs when you're in this, and kind of define that the market a little bit more, that they should be aiming more specifically in their marketing at a customer rather than marketing to service or satisfaction.
That's right. I mean, it could be done based on those profiles. A bank could really target people that have low share of wallet, and there would be potential for growth. So if you look at traditional marketing, where you just have a newspaper ad or a TV ad, and you kind of throw it at everybody in the population, but you know that a lot of people are not in the target group, so there's a lot of waste, if you will, a lot of noise really too. So you could have a mail out to customers that are specifically in one segment where you believe, well, they really do have potential for growth, and you could actually generate more business by looking better after them, I suppose, or specifically offer investment products or consolidation in terms of borrowings and whatnot, and offer more competitive products, really. Also, what I started thinking when I did the research here was, to what extent does a bank reward loyalty, right? Because loyalty, I mean, you could be loyal to many, many things. The term loyalty is not reserved only for business. You can be loyal to your country, you can be loyal to your partner, you can be loyal to a service provider, you can be loyal to your employer. So loyalty is, used in organizational behavior and the like. And some people argue that loyalty should really go both ways. Now, I would assume, but that's not necessarily being tested here, unless you want to read more into overall satisfaction or affective attitude. To what extent do people really believe that they're rewarded for their loyalty? And if you remember the chart, tenure, length of relationship, a lot of people have been with their bank for a long time. And I would not be surprised, and that's not just speculation, that's moving away from the study. I would not be surprised if quite a few of those people who have been with their bank for 15 years plus would feel that, well, they have not necessarily been rewarded for their loyalty. And I argue in my thesis, there are different industries. For example, if you look at the airline industry, where people could be a member of a loyalty program, and the more you fly, the more perks you get, lounge access, possible upgrades, more luggage access and the like. So you may feel more rewarded for your business, and possibly also for the length of the relationship. Or if you look at the Australian Automobile Association, NRMA, you got the year when you actually joined as a member printed on your card, which in banking, you may have been with your bank for 15 years, but it's not really visible as such. How much this would make a difference, I don't know. It's probably also very difficult to measure. But that was a thought when I saw, well, how many people have been with their main bank for quite a long time? And do they really feel rewarded, not only receiving adequate service, but is there some little reward in some form for that tenure, if you will? Yeah, please.
You have retail banking here. Do you integrate the virtual banking as well as an element to, that impacts on age and loyalty?
Yes.
And the collapse of time?
Yes. That's. We did measure satisfaction with technology, because as you say, a lot of business has shifted from the bank branch to ATMs and also the internet. So these were precisely the two dimensions that we did measure, to what extent people were satisfied with electronic banking, if you will, ATM, and the internet. And in that particular analysis, the variable was not significant in any case. So one might assume that it is a significant predictor. So whether or not your ATM actually works, or whether or not the internet is reliable and safe and secure, may well explain something, but it did not explain loyalty. There is a thing called hygiene factors in business, or also in organizational behavior, where certain factors are just seen as a given, right? So there's different levels, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but let's say if you board a plane, for example, you expect to arrive in good shape. So that's kind of a hygiene factor. Very few people jump off a plane and go, yeah, we survived, right? It's kind of, you walk off and you think, yes, of course, and we were even late, right? But in actual fact, well, there was always a chance that you may not have arrived, right? So it's kind of, shouldn't say that. Is anybody traveling in the near future? So that's seen as a hygiene factor. And I would not be surprised if in banking, well, the ATM works. Well, that's a hygiene factor, right? You get terribly upset if it doesn't work, but I'm not excited. Wow, it worked. I got $100. Fantastic, right? It's not going to excite me. As opposed to maybe investing money, where if you get an above average return, you would be very excited and, you know, recommend the bank. But I'm not going to go and have coffee with Rosa and say, well, by the way, why don't you bank with Royal Bank? You know, their ATMs really work. She's going, yeah, well, hopefully so, right? There's maybe one more thing I should add to the discussion, just thinking also about your previous question. If we go back to what I draw here, the, you know, attitude and behavior dimensions. So in the case where people are not necessarily emotionally attached to a provider, but are still loyal in a sense of behavior, that's what's labeled generally in the marketing literature as spurious loyalty. So you're kind of loyal, but you're not necessarily emotionally attached. And I think this may well play into that SERVQUAL discussion. So it may or may not be. I'm not saying this is now kind of a discussion no longer really based necessarily always on the data. But let's say in banking, probably a lot of the things that were measured by SERVQUAL I would see as hygiene factors. So for example, I enter the bank branch, tangibles, it's clean, it's nice uniforms of the staff. That's all nice and good, but it's not going to excite me. I just see it as a given. So that may be one of the factors that explain why SERVQUAL was not necessarily a strong predictor in the multivariate analysis of this study. I'm not too sure whether that makes sense.
The service industry from consumers is a lot higher in terms of the service that they like to have as opposed to other industries. I just find that banking, customers really have a higher level of needs of what they expect, and if you defect from that a little bit, it's always, you know, it affects them a lot, I find, as opposed to if you were to go to, let's say, there's another retail service, and you don't, for example, you get the eye contact, or you don't get the warm greetings, you won't really notice that bit. You're just as happy that you made the purchase and you're out of there, but you won't go and complain or anything.
Right.
I think with banking, it's so easy for people to bring up these disinfectors that they haven't received this type of experience. Do you find that in doing?
So,
Well, we need that. I guess the expectations
Right.
higher. So, and that's why I think banks right now, everybody's trying to get better and trying to do something different in order to capture another experience for the customer. And if you look at how banks right now are repositioning themselves and renovating their branches, it's becoming more of a place of, they're trying to get away from that image and get more to an image of, you know, you come in there and it's a little, you know, we're professionals, but, you know, it's not as rigid as before, and we're friendly, and they have like readers and everything in their banks now. I think the credit unions do that very well.
Yeah.
Credit unions, but I think that's what it's becoming, and banks have an understanding that this is some of the, I think, the needs, you know, I just think consumers of what they're looking for.
yes. Well, it's a good question. There are certainly changes in consumers' expectations. When I think back to when I was working in the banking industry, the expectation probably of the average customer was, well, a banker has to be, you know, in a dark suit, very proper. But if you walk into a retail bank now, you would see that has changed quite a lot. I think, you know, a lot of staff are permitted to wear jeans and, you know, have earrings, and it's much more casual. Now the question is, probably in marketing we're obsessed with segmentation. You can probably never really please absolutely everybody. So if I look at, for example, my mom's generation, she's terribly upset that this is happening. She believes that, you know, a banker should always be dressed up, and there should not be people serving customers in the bank branch in jeans and t-shirt. But probably to the young generation, that's precisely what they find attractive. Because the young people in the old days when they went to a bank, they always felt a bit like, you know, oh my goodness, there's these mature people all dressed up, and I'm here with my $50 opening a savings account. So they didn't really feel comfortable. But it probably boils down to segmentation, as you know, segmentation based on wealth, based on income, maybe based on culture. If you look at Australia and Canada, there are now major banks offering services targeted at certain cultural groups, for example, Asian banking, where you adapt the product specifically to the needs of that customer group. So, but for banking, services, it's a fine line because it costs a whole lot of money to set up all the e-services, the internet. And at the very beginning, at least some banks I know, the assumption was we're going to set up internet banking and we can reduce the costs on the network side, right? Because everybody's going to do internet banking, nobody's going to go to the bank branch. Guess what? That didn't happen at all. Yes, a certain percentage of people actually did online banking, but a certain category, maybe the more mature, maybe the more traditional, still wanted to have the brick and mortar banking, actually talk to a person. It may also depend on the business. If you invest, a large amount of money, do you just want to do it online, or do you prefer to talk to an actual person? So it's not as easy as it may seem in that respect to manage expectations of the customer. But I think the key to success would really be segmentation. And that's what banks are already doing. There's private banking, there's retail banking, investment banking. So they're probably already doing quite a lot in that respect. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks very much for a very knowledgeable, insightful presentation. At least
Thank you.
It certainly got me to think about our own banking behavior and
Yeah.
quality.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Rosalie. And thanks very much for your interest. Very much appreciated. Please email me. Feel free to email me if there's any follow-up questions. Yeah.